Good afternoon. Welcome to today's colloquium. Today we're honored to have K.A. Nelson. K.A. served 6 years as a Marine Corps officer after graduating from Penn State University. He, inspired by diving the wrecks of merchant ships torpedoed off the Jersey Shore, he researched and wrote Killing Shore over a period of 3 years. He lives near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And with that, let's welcome K.A. to the lab.
Thank you all very much. Before anything else, I'd like to thank Dr. Wilt as well as Evan Wilt, no relation, for helping to arrange this event today. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. So I don't have a whole lot more to say for myself. What I want to talk about today is a few of the themes in my newly released book. Came out on April 4th. I'm only going to talk about the book a tiny bit to give you a little bit of context to everything else that I'm going to cover. So one of the challenges of giving speaking presentations like this is that the subject matter behind this book is so broad. It brought a whole level of challenge to actually writing it because I had to be very, very cognizant that I wasn't going off on too many tangents. And the very first one of these presentations I ever gave, which was back in December, this is number 13 or 14 for me now, but the very first one, I just tried to cover too much. So what I did for this go-around for you guys is I wanted to cover 3 discrete topics out of the book. And that the first 2 are going to cover the strategy and tactics of the U-boat war, so really looking at it from the German perspective, the how and why at both the big picture level as well as at the level of like an individual ship being sunk. And then knowing that we have some science and engineering types, at least a few in here, that was a joke. I'm a liberal arts guy, so I'm like, feel way out of school. I want to talk a little bit about some of the engineering behind the book. So without further ado, a general overview of what this book is. I should say that it came out on April 4th. I have seen a few hard copies floating around, which is awesome. You can find it on Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble's in my area, as well as in New Jersey. I don't know how widely Barnes & Noble's stocking it in the store, but Barnes & Noble has it on the website. The title is Killing Shore, the true story of Hitler's U-boats off the New Jersey coast. It is quite a long book, and it really covers actually the entirety of U-boat operations in the Western Hemisphere, albeit with a focus on the main story is really focused on New Jersey and New Jersey-ish events. So the part 1 really provides a history of submarine technology, of their role in the First World War, of how the First World War previewed the Second, and gives just kind of a high-level overview. Part 2 is what I call the main story. It's 11 chapters, each of which is about a single ship that was sunk off New Jersey, and those 11 ships are kind of woven together along with parts 1 and 3 into a whole story. So my objective was not to write a collection of events or collection of anecdotes, but is really telling one story from start to finish. That was one of the hardest things about putting it together. And then chapter 16, 17 kind of talks about how the war ends, and then it brings events up to the present day. But the reason that I'm going over this, and this is the last I'll talk really about the book specifically, is just to give you a context of what I'm talking about. Both of those news articles down there, I should mention, both of them were I cited hundreds and hundreds of news articles from 1942, those 2 being among them. So before I get into any of those 3 topics, I want to give you guys a better understanding of really what could be called the horror of what's being talked about here. And I found that the easiest way to do that is in the form of numbers. So one of the things that I realized in doing the research for this book is that there are a wide body of statistics related to this topic that simply have never been calculated. Not because no one's had the ability to, it's just, as I learned the hard way, it's very painstaking work, and I crashed Excel multiple times populating it with data. But I realize that there's a lot of statistical information that's just never been calculated. So a big part of what my research entailed, a small big part, was actually finding this info, collating it, and then actually drawing some numbers from it. So the figures you're about to see, I think I'm the first person to ever actually calculate these. So most of the activity that happened in U.S. waters, and by U.S. waters, I'm saying out to 400 nautical miles, almost all of that was in 1942. So these figures are from January to August of 42. If we covered the entire war, they wouldn't actually change that much because almost everything happened in that window. So during that time, the waters within 400 nautical miles of the United States accounted for 29% of all merchant ships destroyed worldwide during that 8-month period. 47% of all the ships that were damaged, and 24% of all the naval ships that were sunk in that time period. Just to give you a sense of how much the Schwerpunkt of the Atlantic War really came to North America during that time. But it gets worse because there was a human toll that's obviously entailed with this level of destruction. And per my comment a minute ago, this looks at the entirety of the war, but almost all of these are from 1942. So that is 610 U.S. servicemen, 2,868 neutral and allied merchant mariners, and then 183 non-U.S. servicemen, mostly British, Norwegian, Canadian, and a handful of Dutch. So I have taken to starting off my presentations with these figures because I think this tells a story better than I could in just a few minutes of the sheer scale of destruction that came to the waters around North America during 1942. And I should mention, we'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll go to Q&A. So if anyone has any good questions, please save them and we'll get to those at the end. So the first of the three topics that I want to cover is the actual strategy, what was going on behind closed doors in Berlin and Wilhelmshaven and elsewhere where the U-boat campaign was being planned and executed. So there's really three broad principles, and this is just what I'm distilling it down to. The first of which being a phrase, if anyone is familiar with the German language, called Handelskrieg. It stems from the First World War. What it means is trade war or merchant war. And we're not talking about import and export policies. The Handelskrieg in this context refers specifically to destroying an enemy country's ability to conduct trade, so to move goods from point A to point B across the ocean. It was the Germans around 1915 in the first year of World War I that realized how the deck was stacked against them, right? Britain, and remember, this is first few months of the First World War. So Britain has put Germany under a full naval blockade that they cannot get out of and they can't defeat. They are fighting France and Britain on the European continent on its western side. They are fighting the Russians on the east, who have mobilized much faster than the Germans realized. And their only ally in Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was pretty weak. So the Germans start to think, okay, what can we do to really make this war hurt for our enemy? And it did not take a brilliant economist to realize that, hey, Britain imports almost everything by sea. Food, cotton, rubber, steel, oil. If we can destroy the ships that are bringing in those goods, the British will not be able to fight and they will not be able to prop up the Allied alliance. And in that sense, they were right, and they very nearly pulled it off in 1917 of cutting Britain off. But this role for U-boats would carry forward into the Second World War. So in both World Wars, U-boats, which I should mention, it's just the term for German submarines in either of the World Wars. U-boats could and did sink naval ships. They sank battleships, they caught a few carriers, but really what they existed to do and their primary mission was to destroy merchant ships. So freighters carrying dry cargo or tankers carrying liquid petroleum-based cargo. That was their prime reason for being. Oftentimes when they sunk their naval ships, it was just it was like a shark attack where a ship was in the wrong place at the wrong time and a U-boat got a shot at them. They generally weren't actively hunting naval ships. So the first of these three principles is the idea of we are going to destroy the enemy's ability to bring anything into or out of his country. The second principle is a concept called integral tonnage. This was thought up by the head of the German U-boat fleet. His name was Admiral Karl Dönitz. His name might be familiar to some of you who are familiar with World War II. Dönitz succeeded Hitler for about 2 weeks after Hitler's death. But Dönitz, he had a specific interpretation of how he looked at tonnage. And of course, that's how merchant shipping is measured. Back then, it was gross registered tons. They use different measurements now, but gross registered tons corresponded to how much cargo a ship could carry. So that's how ships were measured. This tanker is 7,050 tons, et cetera. So Dönitz's whole strategy against the Allies was basically attrition. It was, I'm going to sink ships faster than the Allies can build them. And he did not, what integral tonnage meant was he didn't differentiate between types of ships, what country they belonged to, or where they were. In his mind, an Allied merchant ship is an Allied merchant ship. Doesn't matter where it's sailing, what it's carrying, or what flag it's sailing under. Basically, he viewed all of Allied merchant shipping as a single totality. So he wasn't focusing on necessarily a certain route or ships from a certain country. Finally, there's another German term, like the first one. This one is Schwerpunkt. If anyone here has been in the military or has done some reading of doctrine and theory, you might be familiar with the term center of gravity, which is roughly the English equivalent to it. The Schwerpunkt is simply a German concept referring to a focus of combat power at a specific point in time and place to achieve a specific objective. So the way that Dönitz saw this is he would send his U-boats, he would focus them wherever merchant ships were the most vulnerable. So essentially, whatever place on the globe he could sink the most merchant ships with the least risk to his U-boats is where he would go. And if you watch the first half of the campaign in World War II, the U-boat campaign, it's sort of like a giant whack-a-mole thing where all the U-boats will go to this area and pick off merchant ships until that area is better patrolled. And then they'll all kind of congregate for a few months somewhere else until that area gets locked down, and then they'll congregate somewhere else. So they're essentially constantly moving to wherever they can find prey the easiest. And this is eventually what brought them to the East Coast in early 1942. Most people, at least most that are historically literate, are broadly aware of the enormous amount of stuff that was produced in the United States during World War II. I thought I understood this till I got eyeballs deep in researching this book. It was beyond even what my comprehension of it was. So a few statistics that I throw around in the book. So over the entire course of World War II, the Japanese Empire built 30 aircraft carriers of all types. The United States built 151. The United States in 1943 alone built more tanks than Germany built in the entire war. By the end of the war, 2/3 of the Allied munition, of the Allied equipment being used worldwide, that's guns, trucks, tanks, jeeps, rifles, were products of American factories. 2/3. That's in the Soviet Union, that's in China, that's in the South Pacific, that's in Western Europe. Products of American factories. The Germans were not ignorant of this. They were very well aware although even they underestimated, I should say that they underestimated a little bit, but they were very well aware of the industrial potential of the United States. It was not only, and I didn't even really mention merchant shipbuilding, probably the single most impressive feat of mass manufacturing in human history was the U.S. output of Victory ships and Liberty ships between 1942 and 1945. It was about 5,300 odd ships, just merchant ships, not including the battleships and the carriers and the cruisers and the destroyers and the submarines and everything else. So in addition to things that get made and roll off assembly lines, at least as important, especially in the early phase of the war, was oil. The United States, at the time of Pearl Harbor, was extracting 62% of all the oil extracted worldwide and had 58% of the world's refining capacity. Again, the Germans were very well aware of this. The Germans, incidentally, were fuel-starved for almost the entirety of the war because Romanian oil was the only thing they had access to. So they're aware that the United States can produce all this stuff, and they're aware that it is basically, as it is today, the oil capital of the world. But it gets even more lengthy because in addition to all those things rolling off American assembly lines, in addition to the enormous amount of oil that's being extracted, refined, and moved, there are also natural resources that are coming from the west of the hemisphere. And I include South Africa on here because most of that stuff got shipped to Trinidad and the Caribbean and the north from there. So all sorts of other critical natural resources. Some of these are found in the United States. Some of them are found Mexico, Brazil, the Caribbean. But all of them, they're either going to Britain and the Soviet Union, or they're going to East Coast ports to get fed into US industrial processes. Now, at this point, so we're talking Pearl Harbor and the 6 weeks that followed. At this time, the convoys that were going to Britain from the Western Hemisphere were mostly leaving from Nova Scotia. There's two ports, Sydney and Halifax. That's where these convoys were leaving from. But there's a problem, because the entire Allied global system of supply hinges on things like magnesium and oil and bauxite and tanks and food being able to get from point A to point B to point C. And sometimes this might be a logistic or manufacturing process with inputs and outputs, and the manganese gets taken from Chile and put into this factory in Philadelphia, and then et cetera. But all of this stuff that is going to Europe via Nova Scotia, all of it, whether it's finished goods rolling off US assembly lines, whether it's things like nickel getting routed north from Trinidad, all of it has to traverse the East Coast sea lanes. Trains can't do it. Trucks can't do it. It has to be moved on ship, and it has to come up that coastline. And this also the Germans understood very, very well. One of the most important source documents that I used for research, the Eastern Sea Frontier War Diary, there was a quote that I thought was perfect from the June 1942 summary, which is describing the shipping lanes along the US East Coast as a single link in a great chain binding together the US and our allies. The Germans, and Dönitz specifically, understood that if that link in the chain can be broken, the entire Allied global supply chain stops. Nothing moves, or nothing goes from the Western Hemisphere to elsewhere, which is where it needs to go. So in these frantic days immediately after Pearl Harbor happens, and the Germans realize they're now going to be going into war against the United States as well, Dönitz puts together this plan and sees this vulnerability. He also knows, and in fact the situation's worse than even Dönitz realizes, he knows that these waters along the coast are not adequately patrolled and protected. In fact, they were effectively unprotected. So again, a case of, as soon as a new territory opens up where I can sink more ships at little risk, I'm going to focus all of the submarines there, which is what he did. So we covered the strategic. I'm now going to drill down a little bit to the tactical about how U-boats actually fought, specifically in East Coast waters. So rule of threes, so another kind of three-part principle here. So during 1942, the U-boat attacks that occurred off the US coast generally exhibited three traits. Not always, but for the most part. The first one is that they were usually conducted on the surface. Obviously, when we think of a submarine, we think about something that can travel underwater, which certainly they could. But for most of World War II, submarines of all nations, they would really only dive to escape if they were under attack, or B, if they wanted to be really, really sneaky. But for the most part, and the same for US submarines, British submarines, they generally attacked from the surface. Reason being, they were much faster on the surface, they had much better visibility, and they can still use their torpedoes. If needed, they would have to do what's called a crash dive, which is when you try to get underwater as quickly as possible. But generally speaking, they the attacks along our coast were mostly conducted by U-boats on the surface. The other thing that distinguished them is that they tended to be from close range. The interwar submarine doctrine from the US Navy, the British Navy, even the pre-Hitler interwar, the Reichsmarine, the submarine doctrine usually called for basically the naval equivalent of a sniper, which would be long-range torpedo shots while submerged. So I'm going to submerge, I'm going to get to within like 2 miles of the target, and then I'm going to fire a fan of 4 and hope my geometry was right. Dönitz threw that out the window when he was given command of the U-boat fleet in 1935. He wanted his boats to get as close as possible. So the prescribed optimum distance was 600 meters, but sometimes U-boat commanders would attack from as close as 400 meters. This is like point-blank range. There's a few advantages to that. Firstly, even if the enemy ship sees the torpedo, they're probably not going to be able to dodge it. Ships of that era, especially naval vessels, could dodge torpedoes. One of probably my favorite battle is Midway, and there were Japanese aircraft carriers that like dodged torpedoes. Ships could do that, but not if it's coming at you from 400 yards away. There's just no time. The other thing is it made it more likely the torpedoes would hit, right? The farther away you get, the greater a small error in your trigonometry can cause your eels to miss entirely. So they were on the surface, and they were generally firing from very close range. I would say of all the reports that I've read, call it like average 900 yards, 900 meters, maybe a little, 800 to 1,000 in my experience. And finally, these attacks were almost always made at night. As you might imagine, if you're operating on the surface very close to targets, even if they're civilian ships, the cloak of darkness is pretty important. So for that reason, the amount of ambient light was quite important, what phase of the moon it was. But these merchant ships and a few naval ships that were attacked along the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, these were U-boats generally on the surface, attacking relatively close range at night. A phrase that is closely associated with the U-boat war and the Atlantic campaign of World War II is, of course, the term wolf pack. I talk about wolf packs a bit in the book because you can't really, I think, talk about U-boats without addressing wolf packs, and also it's pretty badass. But there were no wolf packs along the coast in U.S. waters for a few reasons, but the biggest of which is that the wolf pack was a tactic that was developed specifically to crack convoys, and there were no convoys in American waters. Now, as to why there were no convoys, that's a separate story. But the German U-boat campaign in World War I that had almost succeeded. This was in 1917, just before and just after the U.S. entered the war. The Germans threw a all-out U-boat campaign to try to cut Britain off completely. This was in the first half of 1917. They almost made it. They got closer to defeating Britain with the U-boat in 1917 than they ever would in World War II. It got to a point in April of 1917 where there were 13 or 14 ships going down a day. And the way that the Allies eventually stopped this is finally they instituted basically a global convoy system. So whether you were coming from North America or sailing through the Mediterranean or going from Britain to the continent, ships would be sailing in groups that would be guarded by destroyers, corvettes, things like that. And suddenly the U-boat became almost impotent, right? Because the only way you can get close to a convoy is by what? By submerging. But once you submerge, you're slow, you're almost blind, and it made it much, much harder to sink ships. So tactically, the U-boat was not beaten in World War I. It was really beaten strategically through the convoy policy. So in the interim between the wars, one of the things that occupied Karl Dönitz's time was how do we beat convoys in the next war? And what he came up with is the idea of attack them as a group from multiple sides and get so aggressive that some U-boat commanders would actually go inside the convoy itself and be essentially swerving between ships. But because there were no convoys along the U.S. East Coast, We did not see any of these massive convoy battles like we did in the North Atlantic and even in the Mediterranean to a certain extent. Finally, the third and final topic is I want to talk a little bit about the engineering of the U-boats and their weaponry. And we already got in a little bit of this discussion at lunch, but I'll start over from the beginning here. This diagram was done by a very talented artist in Delaware named Bob Pratt. This was one of 2 custom pieces that I commissioned for the book. He also did the map that you see in the very beginning of the book. So I wanted to give the reader a visual sense of what these things actually look like. So there were 2 main U-boat designs that were used in World War II. There was the Type 7 and the Type 9. There was a few different variants of each. They were pretty much the same thing with the exception that the Type 9 was bigger, had a longer range because it could carry more fuel, and it also had a few more torpedoes. Other than that, they're pretty much the same boat. So in the interest of space, I did an internal diagram of the Type 9 and then an external of the Type 7. What's interesting to note is that there actually isn't much about these submarines that was noteworthy from an engineering perspective. The Allies were shocked when they captured their first one in 1941, the U-570, that it was just an ordinary submarine. If you read the British and American naval intelligence reports where they went over every inch of this U-boat after they got it back to port, the only thing that really blew them away was the periscope. It had a very, very good periscope. Other than that, it was, good. It was a good submarine. It was a little more cramped than either the British or the American ones, but it was comparable in speed and range, and it was not an amazing piece of technology necessarily. It was a solid, reliable, for its era in the first half of the war. So clearly it was not the engineering. These were not wonder weapons or Wunderwaffen. It was the men that crewed them and the culture that they were inculcated with that made them so deadly. So one thing that you might notice is that these don't look much like modern submarines. Modern submarines look a little bit more like a whale. It's big and round and they're not quite as sexy as the ones of the World War II era look like. And the reason that this is a little bit more angular, is considerably more angular and streamlined, is that it's optimized for surface travel, right? So it's essentially the design of a boat that could also submerge and be watertight. The submarines of this era, worldwide, including U-boats, they actually had 2 holes. There was an outer, much thinner hull that was could be flooded. The water flooded, got inside the 2 holes to prevent air bubbles or things that could prevent them from diving. So there was a flexible outer hull, and then there was a much, much stronger inner hull called the pressure hull. And the pressure hull is where the crew actually inhabited. Anything that was the crew's living space. A few features, as you can see on the top one, all U-boats in the first half of the war had a gun mounted on the forward deck. The Type 7 had the 88 millimeter, and then the larger Type 9 had a 105. Those guns were oftentimes used for finishing off a wounded ship. There were quite a few ships along the East Coast that were torpedoed, halfway sunk, abandoned, but there was a strong emphasis on making sure the ship was actually gone so that it couldn't be salvaged. So oftentimes they would fire shells at the waterline until it flooded and went down. By 1943, those deck guns had been removed because by that point it was becoming too dangerous to operate on the surface like they preferred to. All U-boats also had in 1942, I should say, because this armament changed throughout the war, they had a 20 millimeter fully automatic anti-aircraft gun on that platform you can see up behind the bridge, and then the larger Type 9 had a 37 millimeter semi-automatic gun on the aft deck. Later in the war, they would add more guns and they would move them all to the middle. The interior of this thing, there was just one level. So you climbed down the ladder into the control room, and didn't have separate decks. There were 2 toilets, but it was just like an airplane toilet. No bathing facilities. There were enough bunks on board for half the crew, so they would hot bunk. if you look at towards the bow, up at the front, this was where the junior enlisted men slept. So there's actually bunks on the side that could be folded down, but oftentimes they would end up sleeping on top of the torpedoes. The officers and senior petty officers were behind them. The control room is right under the periscopes here. Engine room, diesel engine, electric motor, and then the aft torpedo room. And the Type 7 is almost the same interior. A couple of things are moved, and it's obviously a little bit smaller, but functions the same way. These were very simple machines. This was a really big diesel motorboat that could also go underwater and could sink quite a few ships. The final thing I'll note is that there are two different periscopes. One of them was used one of them also gave a view overhead, and that was called the sky periscope or the navigating periscope. The trade-off is that it had a bigger head, so it was more visible. But if a commander wanted to poke up and be able to see directly overhead, either to check for planes or to navigate from the stars, they would use the navigation sky periscope. The other one is the attack periscope, which was smaller, and this was operated from the compartment in the tower. So if you ever see in submarine movies down in the control room where the commander's like this, that was done in U-boats. That was only for photo ops. If a commander was submerged looking through the attack periscope, he wasn't down in the control room. He was up seated in the tower. Second and last engineering topic, I want to talk a little bit about the weaponry, the primary weaponry of these vessels. So I am a bit of a war nerd, and I'm not an engineering or science guy other than casually. But I really love the technology of this era, we're post steampunk, but pre-digital, and it's all analog, and it's gasoline, and I love that shit. So if you read the book, you'll see quite a lot of geeking out about how all these different weapon systems worked. I had to kind of self-teach myself, how shock waves propagate through water and all sorts of things that I, have no credentials in. So, but one of the most recurrent weapon systems in this book, obviously, is the torpedo. So this was the G7 torpedo. All of the torpedoes that were used by the U-boat force were variants of this G7. It might have a different fuse on it or a different guidance system. But each one of them was almost 24 feet long, weighed about 3,400 pounds. The electric one was a little bit heavier. There were two primary types in 1942. There was combustion-powered using air, or there was the electric motor. The key difference between them is that the electric ones required a lot more maintenance, but the electric ones left no trail of bubbles behind like the air ones did. So the air ones would usually be used against merchant ships at night where it didn't matter so much if they could see the bubbles. The incidents like Chapter 8, where the U-578 approaches the USS Jacob Jones going against a destroyer, they had two electrics that were fired and then one more ready to go. The idea being that if you're going to attack a destroyer, which is already a bold move, don't do it with something that points back to your direction. So these U-boats that came to the East Coast in 1942, they would usually carry half and half of the G7A versus the G7E. But it's the same weapon. It's just a different propulsion system. The warhead consisted of 617 pounds of hexanite, which was a TNT-based explosive boosted with powdered aluminum. So which is, on the scale of military technology, it's not like the biggest thing that's ever gone boom, but you have to remember that whether it's a destroyer or merchant ship, these hulls are thin. These ships are not, they don't have belt armor like a battleship does. So one of these torpedoes hitting it can achieve catastrophic effects. Sometimes it takes 5 or 6 to sink a ship, which was very frustrating to a commander because he's burning through his ordnance. But the amount of devastation that these things could unleash was mind-boggling. And I had no idea until I got into doing the research that these things were 23.5 feet long. I was thinking like a torpedo, like, 8 feet, 9? No. They're huge. And even the small Type 7 could carry The Type 7 could carry 14 of these, and the Type 9 could carry 21 of these 26 or 24-foot, 3,500-pound weapons, which is pretty amazing. They had two different kinds of detonators. I talk at length in the book about a subject called the torpedo crisis. Essentially, the magnetic detonators, which are what most torpedoes today use, were not working for the Germans early in the war, and it became a big scandal. They ended up having to switch to impact detonators only. And so the U-boats that came to the East Coast only had impact detonators. If they had had a working magnetic detonator, it would have been much, much worse. I crunched the numbers on it, and the losses would have been about double in both ships and lives. But fortunately, they only had these dulled fangs of the G7A and E with the impact detonator. The guidance for these was pretty sophisticated. I can't go into depth on it here because it's kind of complicated, but the submarines of this era had targeting computers, and every country had their own version of it. The German one was better than the British, but not quite as good as the Americans. It was essentially an analog calculator that could do your targeting math for you and then plug the firing solution directly into the torpedo. The torpedo had a gyroscope in it, so assuming that you did the process correctly, you did not even have to have the torpedo tube faced at the ship. You could be running this way, running at a 90-degree angle to your target if you needed to, and the torpedo could turn up to 90 degrees and still find its target. The way that it worked is the gyroscope is that there was a ring around a gyroscope, and when the calculator achieved the firing solution, it would turn that ring to a certain degree heading. When the torpedo was then shoved out of the tube, that gyroscope would start spinning. The mechanics could determine, as the torpedo is moving through the water, it realizes that the gyroscope is not lined up with the ring. So the gyroscope turns the fins until they're aligned. That's how you can get this thing to curve off like a guided missile when, in fact, it's just going on a gyroscope. Back in World War I, they had to actually aim the tube at the target. Later in the war, the Germans and the Americans developed homing torpedoes that could follow the sound of a ship's screws. So I'm starting to get into pretty sophisticated technology. The German homing torpedo was sort of a success, but not really, but it does play a somewhat important role in this book later on. But this was a torpedo with two hydrophones in its nose, and it would listen to this. It was an anti-destroyer weapon, so they would listen for the sound of the high-pitched whirring of a destroyer screws. Merchant screws would be slower, and it would follow in, and the idea was that the U-boats could take out the escorts first. The idea didn't really work, but it did sink quite a few Allied destroyers. And then they also came up with pattern-running torpedoes for attacking convoys. They were LUT, L-U-T was one of them, and then FAT was the other one, F-A-T. But essentially, the torpedo would run straight for a certain period, and then it would start doing a pattern like this. The idea being that you could be less accurate as long as it got near a convoy. It would hit something eventually. It sort of worked, but not really. And that is all that I have for you folks. I want to thank you all very much for your time and attention. Now I will turn it over to questions until Dr. Wilt cuts me off. Thank you. He had his hand up first. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about submarine resupply at sea and the milk cows? Because that's really fascinating.
Yep. So he might have actually beaten us to another question that comes up 90% of the time in Q&A, which is, how did the U-boats stay fueled? How were they able to come so far and operate? He asked, can you tell me about how they were refueled at sea when they were? So, two-part question. First part is that the Type 7 and the Type 9 had enough fuel to come to the East Coast, operate for 1 to 2 weeks, and then turn around. Both of them could do that. The Type 9 could spend a little bit more time. The amount of time they could spend on station was really dependent on how much running around they were doing. So if they were chasing targets all over the place, then they're going to run out of fuel sooner than if they were kind of lurking around. But the lack of refueling was not a showstopper for either the Type 7 or the Type 9. Now, later in that spring and getting into the summer of 1942, finally the admiral in charge of the U.S. Navy, who sucked, starts to do his job a little bit. And suddenly it's not so easy hunting for the U-boats anymore. This is getting into like by May of 1942. So what does Dönitz do? Remember, his plan is he always shifts his focus to the weakest point. If suddenly the East Coast is becoming more dangerous for U-boats and there's fewer ships, well, he's going to find the next spot. Well, the next spot was to just keep going south, the Gulf of Mexico. But that's a really long way from even occupied France. So April of 1942 saw the Germans deploy a brand new kind of U-boat, the Type 14. It had no torpedo tubes. It was a resupply U-boat. It had bakeries, machinists, doctors. Most importantly, it carried hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel. And what they could do, and this was how the Caribbean was already an era, but the way that the Gulf of Mexico became another very bloody spot between May and August of that year. So the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico campaigns kind of overlap. So starting in April, they ended up building 10 of them. This Type 14, they called them the Milchkuh, the milk cow, but it was a resupply U-boat, and they would link up and sort of like an UNREP today. Sometimes they couldn't find each other. The ocean's really big, but for boats that were going into the Gulf of Mexico to sink tankers, they would usually link up with the milk cow near Bermuda, top off the fuel, and then a Type 9 could get as much as 10 days of Gulf of Mexico, which were all the way to the Mexican coast. They were already operating in the Caribbean, but so the deployment of the refueling boats in April really, that's what allowed the Gulf of Mexico to become a massacre for a couple months, and that expanded their ability to operate places like the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Sir?
So what, I guess, was the strategy that the U.S. employed to counter these U-boats? What made it so that they were only really effective in 1942 and not really as much later in the war?
Radar is probably the single biggest thing. There is a number of converging factors. The single biggest one is radar, because if you have radar, I can see you when you're on the surface. That forces you to submerge, and when you submerge, you're pretty much impotent, right? Once you've submerged, they can't do much. So they were used to 1939 through early 1943 being able to operate on the surface, and they mastered a style of very aggressive, like a pack of wolves, like a very fast-moving, aggressive, get in, hit them, get out, dive if you have to. But once Allied radar, especially airborne radar, was very widespread, there's nowhere to hide anymore. I mean, you can submerge, but you can only stay under for a few hours anyway, and it's hard, you can't chase a convoy underwater. You got to be on the surface through that, but as soon as you surface, they ping you with radar. And the Germans actually developed radar detectors with, again, it never really worked great, but so they knew, they could oftentimes tell when they were getting lit up, painted. So you put them in military terms, what's called the horns of a dilemma. You can't do this because you'll get killed. You can't do this because you'll get killed. So you end up doing this and you still get killed. That's the goal, is to put the enemy in a position where he has no good options. And that's where the U-boats found themselves by mid-1943. Yes, in the end.
Hi. How many boats were there off the coast of Jersey? Like, how big of a presence was there?
So, good question. I don't have a number offhand for you, but I'll tell you that they usually spent about 2 weeks-ish, and they wouldn't be limited to one state. So when I focused on New Jersey events, I focused on ships that were within a general window. So total, like all the U-boats that passed through, we'll say within 200 nautical miles of New Jersey, 3 dozen maybe. As far as the number of ships that were sunk there, I think it's in the book, but I think I had 28 from World War II were in that, what I consider like a New Jersey zone. As far as total numbers of U-boats that U-boat patrols along the coast, we'll say within 400 nautical miles of American shores, call it, and I could, if you gave me an afternoon, I could come up with the exact number, but call it 100, maybe 120. So enough. It was enough. Yes?
Given how resource-starved Germany was for so much of the war, was there ever conversation within the German government of disable and capture the supply ship, the merchant ships, rather than fully destroy them? I'm sure they were seeing, these merchant ships with these barrels of oil that they desperately needed going down to the bottom of the ocean, and I'm sure some parts of the government were not particularly happy about that. Was that a conversation that he had to have?
No, that's a very good question. And the reason that it wasn't is that there would be no way to get those back to where they could be. So there were a few incidents. First of all, they had blockade runners. I think there was one U-boat that captured a ship and brought it back in all of World War II. I think it happened once. Because you have to remember, even when the British were on the ropes in terms of merchant losses, they still ruled the waves. So even if you captured something, you wouldn't be able to get it anywhere without it getting sunk. But no, the Germans being squeezed for resources, what it resulted in is that Hitler started this war when Germany was not ready in any capacity. And it was not until Dönitz was elevated to be Grand Admiral of the entire Navy in early 1943 that Hitler finally said, I'll give you as much as you need for U-boats. Just name what you need and I'll get it to you. By that point, it was too late. The writing was on the wall. Dönitz was fighting with a shoestring force for most of the time leading up to that. So short answer, no, because there was no way to get them home. But the research squeeze was a big driving catalyst of everything that happened. Sir?
In a modern conflict, how do you see supply chain targeting playing into something as possible?
Excellent question. Check the news and see what happened today. No, that's a really good question, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth because I'm not as well versed on modern shipping as I am from shipping from 80 years ago. So I hope smart people are looking at that question. It's a great question. I don't know. I will say that the United States, has again found ourselves in a position where we do not have enough merchant ships. We don't have enough ships of any type, but I know a couple of people that are retired merchant marine, very smart people that are very, very adamant that we do not have the sea lift, either military or civilian, to sustain what could be, any number of major contingency scenarios. So from what I know, the United States needs more ships today. But as far as how a future Handelskrieg might look, A, I don't want to know, and B, I don't feel informed enough to really pontificate, but that's a great question. Sir?
Why weren't convoys on the up the East Coast?
So, have you ever, I was going to take a dig at Admiral King, but I've already had like 8 of those today. So it was partly shortage of resources, partly stubbornness, and partly having an overall boss that just doesn't care. All right, that's 9 King digs. So there were a few competing ideas about, hey, convoys should be organized this way, they should be defended this way. Now, the British were already well experienced in running convoys, but this admiral didn't want to hear any of their advice. So what he essentially said is, well, we'll suck it up till we have enough planes and ships to have bulletproof convoys. Well, that's not what was needed. If you have convoys within range of land-based air cover, you can have 2 Coast Guard cutters guard an entire thing, keep them close to shore. They're going to be much, much safer and move mostly during the daytime. They're going to be much safer. So my point is that there were easy solutions to this problem that certain people, and more than just the one guy, certain people were just they didn't have enough initiative or creativity, and they were too far with their heads stuck inside themselves to, but much of this could have been avoided. Those numbers I showed you earlier, they could have been much, much less, but common sense initiatives were not taken. So, sir.
Do you have a sense as to the sort of like accuracy of these torpedoes? So for example, would a U-boat commander expect to launch 4 with 1 hit, or launch 4 torpedoes and have 2 hits, or?
No, great question. When they putting aside, and I didn't go to the German torpedo crisis just because that's a whole, I could do a whole presentation just on that. It's kind of complicated. Short answer is they were pretty accurate. There were a number of variables, including distance, how fast is the target moving, am I going to have any of these? So when the events of my story, the main story take place, most of the torpedo crisis has been resolved except for depth control. They're still having a problem with some torpedoes running too deep, which could make it miss the target entirely. So assuming that your depth control is not a problem, and assuming it's a good commander and a good crew, they were pretty accurate. A fan of, and a lot of times they would fire single torpedoes, but a fan of 3, oftentimes I'd see at least 2 hit. Because I've read through so many logbooks and the German logbooks and the attack reports and everything. Oftentimes they were firing single torpedoes or pairs, and oftentimes you had 1 hit, 2 out of 2 hit, 2 out of 3 hit. Occasionally you'd have a 1 out of 3, but they were pretty accurate, provided that they didn't have mechanical problems and the captain, aimed it well and everything worked. But yeah, considering it's just analog technology, pretty good. Yes, blue shirt.
In the intro, we learned that you got interested in U-boats by diving on them. Can you give us one takeaway of something you saw or learned from your diving?
Sure. So I was just down in North Carolina a couple weeks ago, and that's the mecca. That's one of the world meccas of wreck diving. But within the United States, nothing comes close, and tons of war wrecks too. That's the graveyard of the Atlantic, even before the World Wars. And I dove. It's rare for me at this point to dive something for the first time, like a war wreck. There's only so many that are really feasible. And I dove one down in North Carolina a couple weeks back called the W.E. Hutton, and it was a tanker that was actually hit by Eric Topp, who's quoted many times in the book. And the tanker, it sank upside down. So I've never seen a ship, it blew, me and my friends, it blew our minds because none of us had seen a war wreck on the East Coast that was this intact. I took a couple of pictures till my camera died, but it sank upside down. So when you come down the line, you're on the keel, and then it's 500 plus feet long, and when you get towards the bow, there's suddenly you're going along the keel, and then it drops off and it's flat. That's where the second torpedo he fired basically broke the bow off, and then it turtled and sank like that. So you're swimming over, and it looks like an intact hull. There's pieces of plating that are falling away, so you can go inside. But suddenly it just kind of drops off, and you can see looking down, and then you can go down and look in the ship. But you can see where the torpedo broke the front part of the ship off, which that's just the coolest shit in the world, man. If someone can find something cooler than that, let me know. I'm going to tell you it's not as cool. Did that answer the question, I hope?
I'd love to hear ours, but that was great. Thanks.
Yeah, I've got more. A lot of the wrecks, especially Jersey ones, there's not a lot of left of them. It's more of like, some of these are more of like a pile of rubble, which is I'm still going to go see it and take pictures and shit, but it's not quite the same as like something like the Hutton or the Atlas was the other one we dived. But North Carolina's just great for that stuff. There's one over here. Sir.
I can imagine staying on one of these for like up to a month. That's what I'm inferring, with no showers and whatever they're eating.
Yep.
Is there any more color you can provide on what
Sure.
it's like?
So there were, I didn't even mention it yet, but you seem to be have figured out that this would have really sucked. Yeah, you're right. So there were a number of incentives. In fact, the guys, even the junior enlisted guys on these boats, were given pretty much every perk and incentive that can be given. Bonuses, extra time off to patrols, the best food, even when they were on patrol. I mean, it all tastes like diesel after a week, but it was the best quality food that they could be sent out with. The best entertainment when they were in port. They'd come back to port and they'd have bands and girls greeting them on the pier with flowers. So they did everything possible to try to entice people and to get them to, because otherwise, who would sign up for this? But yeah, it sucked. And all sorts of things like heat rashes was a big one. These guys weren't bathing. They generally, if they brought any change of clothes at all, they would bring one extra pair of underwear. So you have one for the way out and one for the way back. Yeah, exactly. You're wearing mostly civilian clothes, mix and matched pieces of uniform. If you see the commander in Das boots wearing like a red checkered shirt, very common. Other than headwear, a lot of times you would not even really look like a military unit. Not shaving, so everyone's got a beard to some length. But yeah, it sucked, and for that reason, they were given every perk that they could. And then, of course, there's the, why would you be on a destroyer when you could be part of this elite swashbuckling? I mean, there was big propaganda push to try to get men to sign up, to extol their achievements among the populace. In fact, one of the most famous U-boats, when it was sunk and most of the crew was captured in March 1941, one of the things the British noted in their interrogation report is that these guys all seemed arrogant because they were used to being like celebrities at home because they were the U-99. They were, the best. And so every perk was given because your takeaway was correct. It was terrible. Sir?
I noticed in the diagram that the Type 7 had a radio direction finding antenna, but the 9, it wasn't either called out or maybe it changed shape.
It's the circle thing. Yeah. So it's not on the top one, but it's down there. That was used more for navigating when you were near shore. That wasn't really a tactical asset. In the back.
One more question. What was the considerations with respect to loadout, mines versus torpedoes? The Germans primarily went with torpedoes, but they were capable of laying mines.
Yep, they were capable of laying mines. They wouldn't just bring mines for the hell of it. They would bring it if they were on a mine-laying mission. Chapter 14, there was a number of mines laid along the U.S. coast. But either the Type 9 or the Type 7 could deploy mines through the standard 21-inch torpedo tubes. There were a few mine-laying boats made that had, they pushed this stuff out of the way and they had tubes right here for dropping the mines, but they only made a few of those. All the normal attack boats could just push mines out of the tubes. Yep. And they could usually, for say, the U-373, which laid mines at, there was the mouth of the Chesapeake was mined, and then the mouth of the Delaware Bay was mined, and then Boston as well. What they did is they brought 15 mines each, and then 7 torpedoes with the leftover room. So he finished laying the mines, and then they went and tried to do the best they could with the torpedoes. Sir?
So I see on these diagrams that there are torpedo tubes at the back of the submarine.
Yep.
What real, strategic purpose or tactical purpose would those serve? Is that if you're running away or?
So a number of purposes. I'll give you an example from the book. So when the U-578 sees a destroyer off Cape May, New Jersey, what he did was he fired a fan of 2, and he had the other 2 loaded, and then the third tube loaded. But say he wanted to be, if I was in that position and was attacking a surface ship, I'd want to fire maybe a fan of 4. But I want to, maybe you call it 3, and I want to have one more ready to go up front, and failing that, remember, this isn't like I can't just reload. I've got to have 21-year-old men take these 3,400 things and winch them up and then get them into the tube. So if they're not loaded, ready to go, you're not going to use them. So this was essentially, I can shoot 2 and then have 3 or 4 left over. Maybe if they miss and he sees me and starts shooting, charging at me, it gives me options. Late in the war, when they came out with the Zaunkönig, the homing torpedo, they could follow the torpedo screw or the destroyer screws. What they would do is that they would have, at all times, they'd have one forward tube armed with one and one aft tube, like the Type 9 would have one of both. So that way, that leaves me 1, 2, 3, 4 with dumb torpedoes. And in case a destroyer tries to jump me, I've got one forward and one aft that I can hit back with. So it just gives you more options.
Okay, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, were there any operations that didn't involve engaging merchant shipping?
You mean engaging naval shipping instead?
Well, or agent insertion, or anything else?
Yes, this was rare, and I can't, there's only very, very few instances of this, but Chapter 13 does include the story of there were 4 German agents that were dropped on a beach in Long Island by a U-boat. The same operation, 4 more were dropped in Florida about the same time by another U-boat. That was pretty rare, though, and Dönitz did not like his boats being used for that. He saw it as a waste, unnecessarily risky. So yes, it was very rare, though. Generally, they're going out to blow something up. One more? Yes?
Watchtowers on beaches in Jersey and Delaware, were those effective?
So the watchtower, the towers you're referring to were fire direction towers. So they were made for the guns that were installed at shore at Fort Miles. Fort Miles and other coastal fortifications existed, as goofy as this sounds in our modern day, it existed to stop an invasion force from landing. And remember, like 1940, when Fort Miles was authorized, I mean, they don't have the hindsight that we have now. So those towers were meant to guide the huge battleship-type guns that were in place. The idea was being if a German fleet sailed up to capture Washington, D.C., they could hit their ships with these giant cannons. The thing is, when you have a gun with the range of 26 miles, the curve of the earth has a tendency to kind of get in your way. So it's nice if you're shooting from Cape Henlopen and you have someone at Cape May that's like, you're a mile long that way, and they can adjust. So that's what those were for. They actually had nothing to do with U-boats, and because no enemy surface ships ever sailed up, they never got used. But it's those Fort Miles is a really cool place to tour. I did a speaking event down there a couple months ago. I'd never been there. Blew my mind, very cool. But those were for adjusting big gunfire. All right.
Well, thank you all.